How cruel was family life in the Middle Ages? Imagine being born into a world where hunger was normal, disease was everywhere, and survival was never guaranteed. A world without modern medicine, without comfort, and without security. This was not an exception or a temporary crisis. This was everyday family life in the Middle Ages. From the very first moment of life, danger was unavoidable. Around 1/3 of all children never reached the age of 5. Many died within days or weeks after birth. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, and no real understanding of how disease spread. Childbirth usually took place at home, often in dark, cold, and unclean rooms. For mothers, giving birth was one of the most dangerous moments of their lives, and many did not survive it. Parents did love their children, but love looked different back then. Losing a child was so common that becoming emotionally distant was often a form of self-protection. Deep attachment could mean unbearable grief. In a world filled with death, emotional restraint was a way to survive mentally. Medieval families were not built on comfort or personal choice. They were built on necessity. Every member of the household had a role, and no one was exempt from work. Fathers spent long, exhausting days farming, crafting, or serving a local lord. Their labor was physically brutal and rarely rewarded with security. Mothers worked just as hard. They cooked, cleaned, carried water, cared for animals, raised children, and often worked in the fields as well. Their days were long, their bodies worn down by constant labor, repeated pregnancies, and poor nutrition. Children did not experience childhood as we understand it today. By the age of 6 or 7, most were already working daily. They gathered firewood, carried water, ground grain, and helped with farming. Play was rare and considered unimportant. Survival always came first. Hunger was a constant presence in medieval homes. Most families lived on simple foods such as bread, porridge, and thin vegetable soups. Meat was rare and usually eaten only on special occasions. One failed harvest could mean famine. Parents often skipped meals so their children could eat, even though it was often not enough. Disease and death were never far away. Infections, parasites, and plagues spread easily. Even a small wound could become fatal. When someone died, families mourned briefly, because life had to continue. Work could not stop, even in the face of loss. Religion shaped every part of family life. Suffering was seen as God's will, and illness was often viewed as punishment or a test of faith. Faith offered comfort and hope, but it also brought fear and guilt. Marriage was rarely about love. Girls could be married as young as 12. Women faced constant pregnancies, a high risk of dying in childbirth, and very little control over their lives. Divorce was almost impossible. By modern standards, medieval family life was cruel and unforgiving. But for those who lived through it, this was simply reality. Survival mattered more than happiness, and endurance was the greatest strength a family could have. Despite all this hardship, medieval families continued to exist, generation after generation. They endured not because life was gentle, but because endurance was the only option they had. Survival was not a long-term goal. It was a daily challenge, repeated every morning and every night. Cruelty in medieval family life was rarely intentional. Most parents were not harsh by choice. They were shaped by a world defined by poverty, limited knowledge, and constant danger. What appears cold or heartless to us today was often a form of emotional protection in a time when grief was unavoidable. Parents hardened themselves because loss was everywhere. Children learned responsibility early because innocence was a luxury few could afford. Women carried enormous physical and emotional burdens, while men faced relentless pressure to provide in an unstable and unforgiving economy. There was love in medieval families, but it was practical rather than expressive. Love meant working through pain, sharing scarce food, and doing whatever was necessary to keep the household alive. It was quiet, restrained, and rarely spoken. By modern standards, medieval family life feels shockingly brutal. But for the people who lived it, there was no alternative, no comparison, no escape. Every warm meal was a success. Every child who survived childhood was a triumph. Every winter passed was a victory over a world that offered little mercy. The Middle Ages were not only defined by castles, kings, and battles, they were defined by ordinary families facing extraordinary hardship, day after day. And perhaps that is the most important truth to remember. If we had lived in the Middle Ages, we would not admire their lives. We would struggle simply to survive them. Over time, this way of life shaped entire generations. People learned to accept hardship as normal and uncertainty as unavoidable. There was little room for dreams or long-term plans. Most families focused only on getting through the next day, the next season, the next winter. Cruelty in medieval family life was not driven by a lack of humanity, but by the limits of the world itself. Knowledge was scarce, resources were few, and nature was unforgiving. Families adapted in the only ways they could. Yet even in these harsh conditions, family bonds mattered. Cooperation was essential. Everyone depended on one another to survive. A single illness, injury, or failed harvest could destroy an entire household. By modern standards, medieval family life appears cruel, exhausting, and deeply unfair. But for the people of the Middle Ages, this was life as they knew it. They did not measure happiness the way we do today. Survival was the highest achievement. Every day lived was a success. Every child who reached adulthood was proof of resilience. Every family that endured was a testament to human strength. The Middle Ages were not only an age of knights, castles, and legends. They were an age of ordinary families facing extraordinary hardship with limited means and quiet determination. And that is the final truth. Medieval family life was cruel not because people were cruel, but because the world was. Remembering this helps us understand not only the past, but also how far humanity has come.